All right, we're going to get started. Welcome to Webinar Wednesday, even though it's Thursday, we had to move and shift things around. Um, we're going to shift back to that unpopular topic of COVID-19. We started our Wednesday webinars with that theme at the beginning. We're going to go back to it. But rather than talking specifically about the direct physical effects and impacts of COVID-19, today our presenter is going to talk about some of the mental health impacts and really the sort of indirect consequence of on our physical body on what this has done with respect to working remotely and from home. I know some counties are returning to offices. I know the state of Florida is going to begin returning full-time to the offices. But that said, it's been about 6 months since everyone kind of went into a shutdown mode. And I know the presenter is going to talk about it's going to share some numbers with all of us, but I pulled some numbers yesterday from the CDC. There was a small survey that was done in the last week of August. I don't know what the sample size was, but it said that about 40% of American adults are experiencing some elevated level of stress. And that's interesting. I mean, some people really enjoy working from home. Before we started this webinar, I indicated that on a personal level, even though I work really well sort of remotely on an island by myself, I do miss the collaboration, the spontaneous work that happens in the office, and just that interaction. So for me personally, it's had sort of its effects, but there are strategies to deal with this and to cope. And so our presenter today is Dr. Michael Howell. He is Regional Medical Executive with Cigna Insurance, and he's going to talk about how the COVID-19 has impacted and affected people by working remotely. He's going to talk about this whole issue of loneliness, but he's going to also identify some strategies on how to cope and actually kind of work through this, because no one's really sure when it's going to all end. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Howell. And Dr. Howell, I'm going to minimize my screen so we don't have any problems with bandwidth. If folks have questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. And we look forward to hearing from you. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Eric. I want to say good morning to you, and thank you also to the Florida Association of Counties leadership team for asking me to spend some time with you today. I heard you say that you lived on an island, so we'll have to talk about that a little later. I don't know how you can not have fun living on an island when everybody is by themselves. So, gosh, not in this neck of the woods. So, well, welcome everyone. Let's spend the next few minutes just kind of talking about the topic you see before you. I want to start out with something that I read. The struggle to balance literal survival with all of the things that make surviving worthwhile has never been so clear, with the COVID pandemic forcing many to sacrifice social connections and therefore quality of life for life itself. And yet, being socially connected in meaningful ways is actually key to having health and survival. I start out with that because it is so important to know that if our minds are not right, if one can say it like that, it has a detrimental impact on our body. And why is that important to us? It's important to us because we represent organizations that have employees that carry out tasks in society. And if our employees are not healthy mentally and in a good place in a behavioral space, then it will have a direct impact on your organization. It'll have a direct impact on your output as an organization. So we want to make sure that we're taking care of our people. So not only has COVID-19 impacted us socially, as individuals and impacted our organizations, we have to recognize it's been challenging, debilitating, costly, and for tens of thousands, deadly. And that's an impact. That just knowing that someone in your organization passed away from this dreadful condition is enough to just bring you down. So we're going to talk about how we get us back up as organizations, as individuals. Why should we care? Because healthy employees, from a mindset to a physical being, actually are able to give us a healthy output. And if we don't take care of them, that negative output will be detrimental to our organizations. These are the topics. These are, I guess, some of the session overview, if you will. We want to talk about that loneliness is real. Some people may not even believe that it's real. They may say, well, I've never been alone. I never had loneliness to impact my life. But it is real. COVID made it worse. When you talk about taking kerosene, putting on a bunch of dry tinder, taking a match to it, it lit like a forest fire. And it did not work out well. We're also going to talk about COVID-19 and the mental health disparities within our workforce. I want us to not focus on disparities in a singular or a dual type of condition or perspective. Disparities goes beyond race and ethnicity. Disparities goes into socioeconomics. It goes into housing. It goes into food islands. It goes into the type of work that you do, the type of office space that you have. There's a lot of types of disparities. And then the disparities also impact individuals from a mental health or behavioral health perspective differently. So we need to pay attention to that. And we need to make sure that when we start addressing our population, we're addressing our populations as individuals and not as just one size fits all. I want to talk about some strategies to successfully combat COVID-19 in a pandemic environment. We want to talk about what organizations can do and what people can do. If you're going to be at home, how do you make yourselves, healthy? And then finally, we'll talk about mindfulness. We'll talk about positive, negative emotions very briefly, but we want to make sure people understand there are some things that you can do, that I can do, that we can do to make sure from a mental health perspective, we're in a safe place. Now, loneliness has a definition. It's a subjective perception of a deficit in social connection. Social isolation, in contrast, is an objective measure based on a social network size or frequency of social interaction. So there's a difference. Loneliness is a complex set of feelings that occurs when intimate and social needs is not adequately met. So loneliness is real. It has a definition. It impacts people. And want to kind of make sure that loneliness has ties to being lonely, but loneliness is its own entity altogether. COVID forced societies that may have had issues with having loneliness into a far worse place. We talk about individuals, older individuals, younger individuals, middle-aged individuals that tend to live alone, of which there are about 28% of Americans live alone. When COVID hit, those folks didn't have connections to begin with, or they had very few. And now you put this contagion out there and you tell everyone to lock down, go home, you can't go out, you can't socialize, you can't be with people that you love, and it made it even worse. I have this slide here because I think it's relevant. So this is probably the only scientific slide that you see. But what you're seeing here, and I don't know if you can really see the cursor or not, but what you're seeing here is when we first, it depicts the beginning of COVID, the infectious process, if you will, in wave one, and how it rose. We had people who were sick. We had people that were dying around the world. And then we started getting a handle on it. And what you see here is we decided to determine what we needed to do, and the curve came down from the immediate mortality, morbidity of it. And what you see here was we relaxed a little bit too much here, and then we opened up, and then we see the curve. We got a handle on it, understood. And we'll probably see this curve just kind of bounce around over time because, as you see, there are still pockets of surges. The second wave really had to do with the first wave because when we locked ourselves in, depression came out like it was a bad case of chickenpox. And a term I did not associate with COVID was post-traumatic stress disorder. The drama of closing down, isolating so quickly and abruptly was traumatic to people, and it created serious agony. So we had post-traumatic stress disorder. We also had providers who were burning out. I mean, first responders, they're on nonstop. They're seeing death, they're seeing dying, they're seeing isolation, et cetera. So we see all that in the second wave, and that will continue for a while because the economic injury, we're still recovering from that. Providers are still working long shifts trying to make up and capture the care that was put off. You look at the third wave here, influx of urgent non-COVID conditions, heart attacks, strokes, and people who had appendicitis or abdominal pain that turned out to be appendicitis. They didn't go in and get care because they felt that all of the places that they would go had contagious people in there. And so they decided to stay home, and they became worse. Now, what you'll see in wave 4 is the exacerbation or the worsening of those conditions because of that delayed care. Diabetics had worsening of their diabetic conditions. Those that had kidney issues or kidney insufficiencies went on to have further episodes of kidney failure. Those who did have mild heart attacks went on to have heart failure conditions. So This will continue. We'll see these curves play themselves out over time. I'd love to see this curve again, probably in 6 months, but you're going to see a variety of bumps, and you might even see a few extra curves come in down the road. So Eric was talking about some of his thoughts. These are some of the things I think about. How often I long for in-person related social interaction on a daily basis. Now, I don't know if I'm ready to go sit in an office again, but I do want to be able to go sit out at a Starbucks and have a cup of coffee and maybe catch up on some emails. How comfortable I have become with remote work and using technology. So, now I have technology everywhere. The next one is how I've migrated to video-based technology for everything. I mean, we do social stuff now, not just work stuff via Zoom. We've even gotten a group at work to do a Zoom happy hour. But these are the things that we've resorted to. Now we're going to start breaking out of some of that as the world reopens. But again, the cautions need to stay there. And how my version of loneliness has changed since the COVID pandemic began, it's different now. I may have thought I was lonely before. I've now moderated. I have a different threshold for loneliness. And I'm wondering, is it only me that's changed? I've heard people say this is the new normal. I tell you now, if this is the new normal, this is not normal. This is not normal. So we got to figure out what else we call it. But I don't like calling this normal. We've got to figure out this is just a paradigm shift if you want, but it's not normal. I'm going to kind of transition now to just talking a little bit more about loneliness and the facts behind it. Cigna worked with an organization to perform a study on loneliness in 2018. They used a UCLA loneliness survey. They interviewed over 10,000 individuals of mixed demographics to make sure we had good coverage. And we came out with what we call the Cigna US Loneliness Index. Very important study. It was interesting to read. If you haven't read it, read the 2018 and then also check out the updates in 2019. And here's what we found. We found that for the most part, loneliness is pervasive in the workplace. And as a country, according to some surveys, we experienced a 20 to 30% increase in loneliness once COVID hit. So we looked at tools that we used before COVID, we looked at tools after COVID, just in a general sense. And what we're finding is that some of those same tools that we had pre-COVID are still valuable now. Some we've even gotten better with. One of those might be in the form of virtual medicine. We were tinkering with it before. It is full blown now, and hopefully we'll keep that going for all of us out there that need to see the doctor and are not able to go in. There is a connection between loneliness and behavioral health, and we spend much of our life at work. 90,000 hours at least for many of us that are working full time. And when you do that, you've got to make sure that the workplace is also safe. The workplace is sane. Research has found that behavioral health issues are some of the top causes of long-term sick leave in organizations. That being the case, we've got to make sure that our employees are in a good place. Let's talk about some of the changes we found in the index. What are the indicators of loneliness that have increased across the board? Here are just a few. 58% of respondents in the survey say they always or sometimes feel like no one knows them well, which is up 4% from 2018. More than half report sometimes always feeling alone, up to 6 percentage points. Half always or sometimes feel as though they lack companionship. That's up another 6 percentage points. And nearly half say they sometimes or always feel they are no longer close to anyone. Now that's sad, because one thing as human beings, we crave, we must have, we're designed to have companionship. Now you may be a loner if you want to, but that is not according to the way our bodies and our mindsets are. So when people feel they're no longer close to anyone, they start pulling away, it can have detrimental impacts on them as well. To talk about a couple of other items that have made this worse, we've now, all of this social distancing. I'm a social distance kind of person, but it's really more physical distancing. But no hugging, no handshaking, no touching is wearing on me as well, because sometimes I've had to retool my mind not to put my hand out, and also not to fist bump. So now it's just, hi, how are you, and air hug, whatever. But those things don't encourage our spirits when we're trying to deal with loneliness as an issue. So we need to figure out how we revamp all of this. Now, Eric made a comment that it resonates with me, because the longer we go through this, the more the conversation that I share with folks will change. Because there was a time when we had some conversation with some folks that we were all on the lockdown. Now we're coming out of lockdown. We're seeing treatment remedies on the horizon. And so we'll have to see how we adjust to that going forward, whether we are able to come together more closely. I think for the long term, for the short term or the short intermediate term, we're going to find ourselves in some way kind of still distancing ourselves. So we're going to still have some of the impacts of this as we go forward. How has COVID-19 impacted loneliness? We talked about population and social isolation. It's key to reducing the spread of COVID, but it's also key to increasing the spread of loneliness, which also has a compatriot, which I like to call depression, which also has a cousin called anxiety. So when he talks about stress increasing, anxiety is that piece that they're talking about. I mentioned that human relationships depend on some type of close proximity. You know, being in contact, friendship is essential to humans as food is. So we've got to make sure that we nurture the things that grow our spirits. There's a greater impact on older persons, people of color, those with income disparities. As I mentioned, disparities covers a lot more than just, race and ethnicity. We've got older folks, we've got younger folks, we've got those that live in certain subdivisions, socioeconomic income ranges. All of those are disparities that we need to make sure that we're addressing. And as we mentioned, there are intermediate and long-term risks to social isolation, which we'll move to in a second. One of the groups that's really hit by this COVID is the young group, the age group 18 to 25. Really, we call them the millennial Gen Zers. That group is significantly impacted by this. Now, you would think that they look like they're always connected, they're always on a device. What we now know is that just because you're always on a device, it may not increase loneliness, but it doesn't provide the types of relationship that support building strong connectedness with each other. So just because I tweet somebody, because I text someone, I'm not connecting in the same way, and that lack of connection is what also contributes to our state of loneliness. We have got to be careful that we don't disengage these populations, especially this young population. We'll talk about the older population in a second, but if we don't take care of this younger population, it will have a detrimental and a deleterious impact on American society. Keep in mind, who's the workforce? They constitute a lot of the workforce these days. In a nutshell, when you talk about the impact of the loneliness index survey, we found that poor work-life balance and feelings of inadequate work are associated with poor co-worker relationship and loneliness. If you don't have good work-life balance, we talk about working from home, working from remotely, working from Zoom. When we first started this, I kind of smiled because, we were all of my colleagues, we travel and we get home in the evening or get to where we were going, then we do our emails. So I could always count, if I wasn't traveling, emails would come in from 5 to 8, 9 o'clock at night. Once we started COVID, we locked everybody in. I found that my afternoons got a little better, my evenings, because most of the work was being done between, by 6 o'clock. Well, we're now starting. So, I learned to manage my work-life balance. But now we're starting to see, people starting to get back out again, travel again. We're going to start to see that same thing that we saw before COVID. And we need to be careful that we don't let work and life become imbalanced, because when they do, it has a deleterious outcome. Lonely workers, their work is just not of the same quality. They don't interact well, they don't communicate well, their work is of lower quality. And lonely workers think about quitting their job. Now, we may all think about quitting our job if we hit the lotto. Lonely workers tend to think about quitting their job, lottery or not, more than non-lonely workers. So we need to make sure that the workplace is engaging, inviting, and someplace that people can feel they're productive and they're contributing. I told you I wanted to talk about a little impact on the older folks. The older population is a little different. So I won't even get into the ages of older people, but let's just say those that are late 60s and over. Let's go with those because they're more along the retirement age. So if they're retired or not retired, what tends to happen if they don't have companionship, if they're divorced, if they're widowed, if they don't have a partner, whatever, if they just choose to live alone. If they don't have companionship, isolation tends to impact them a little differently. So they may not groom themselves as well. Now, we joke about the fact that you can see me halfway up. I could have on pajama pants. But there are people now in this COVID environment that wear a sweatsuit all day long. Have to be careful of that. Preparing meals, general hygiene, all that stuff goes away when people aren't taking care of themselves or in a lonely state. Loneliness also impacts their health because of the anxiety and the stress hormones, which can cause an impact on the heart, the joints, if you will, diabetes, dementia, the mind, and even depression, creating suicidal attempts. So you don't have to be alone to feel lonely. You can be in the midst of a crowd and still feel lonely, and you can go home, and that loneliness can just be totally overwhelming. The reality of the loneliness in the workplace is demonstrated by a reduced commitment to an organization, reduced approachability by coworkers, which now makes it worse because, you know, if I'm not approachable, then no one wants to come near me. I can't make new friends or companionship, and it just perpetuates the problem. Increased loneliness leads to poor job performance. We talked about that. And so when we talk about what we do about loneliness in the workplace, we need to make sure that the culture of the workplace is good. The culture of the workplace is improving. Now, what we do at Cigna is we have regular all company webinars, and our CEO and other leadership in the organization, they're on the WebEx, and we're for an hour, and we talk about what's happening. We talk about the organization is doing. We find ways to bring a lot of different people on stage to kind of build us up. Our organizational culture is about keeping us engaged in not only our work, but on ourselves. And that tends to create a culture that supports our desire to be better. So if I were to give you some recommendations, I'd say if you're an organizational lead, make sure you ask your employees about their perception of the being workplace. If you're going to take a survey, get the results, do something with it. Focus on building quality relationships, be creative in finding ways to strengthen social connections. Think of stuff, social happy hours, or video happy hours, or video fun games, but anything that you can think of that's innovative. Make seeking help a no-brainer. Make sure EAP is not stigmatized, because we want people to know they can get help at work if no place else, and then create opportunities to make the workplace fun and engaging. It can be done. I want to pivot a little bit and kind of talk about some disparities within the workplace, our workforce, because we want to make sure we're addressing all of those folks. And so why talk about disparities? Well, we talk about it because, as I mentioned before, one size does not fit all. If you're going to have a solution, the solution must be tailored to the problems. And the problems are different when you talk to different people. So if you're talking to an Asian Pacific population, a Hispanic Latinx population, an African American Black population, an American white population, a Native American population, a population that is possibly socioeconomically deprived or has less resources, you know, essential workers, first responders, these are all populations that you need to make sure that you put your resources in place to deal with in a productive way. I mentioned young Americans. 1/3 of the U.S. workforce is comprised of young adults 18 to 30. That's the population I mentioned before. They represent the dominant workforce for the next decade, if not longer. So if we don't take care of them in a country that was fueled by baby boomers who are at their retiring stages, if we don't nurture these folks, we are in a world of a ride going forward. So again, what we need to do. Now, there's some risk factors implicated in the pandemic-related mental health. There's the COVID-19 related worry. There's elevated levels of loneliness. And there's a thing called individual resilience, which we're going to touch base on in a second. But what we're going to find out is that this population, we need to make sure we're focusing on improving and building their resilience, because that is where they have the greatest opportunity. COVID-19 impacts the ability to receive health care. We talked about folks being locked in, locked at home, not going out. They just aren't going because they're afraid. Well, 4 out of 5 Americans were concerned about going to the doctor's office or the hospital. It's probably 3 out of 5 now, maybe 2 out of 5, 2.5 out of 5, but I will tell you that they're still concerned. Now, it's amazing if folks will go to Walmart and put a mask on, but they won't go to the doctor's office or the emergency room. But I guess there's not enough cases being diagnosed in Walmart, not yet, but you know, we know the cases were being diagnosed in the doctor's office or in the healthcare system. So, well, these are the conditions we need to focus on, because these represent some comorbid conditions that contribute to increased death and long-term illness related to COVID. So we need to make sure that we're focusing on these people in particular. So again, if you've got family, friends that haven't been to the doctor, have a chronic problem, get them over their fear. Go with them if you have to, but let's make sure they're getting the care they need so they don't get further along the continuum of illness. Depression, we talked about it a little bit. It doesn't discriminate. and you really can't tell who's depressed unless they tell you. But here are just some symptoms I won't go through, or some presentations of depression. I won't read all of these, but you've seen people like this. You've been like this. You have family members like this. And I like to say, if you're not on antidepressants yourself, you know someone who is. So depression doesn't just have a big sign on its head. It's insidious, but we need to be able to recognize it. But more so than recognizing it, we need to make sure people understand they can get help for it. COVID does have a differential impact on different industries. The top 5 industries most impacted by depression cover a large spectrum, but you see some of those industries here. An industry that we didn't pay a lot of attention to now remember, we had to focus on first responders. I'm good with that. I'm a first responder. But we missed out in the beginning looking at another population, the essential workers. And some of these folks you see right here are the essential workers of society. And they were always in the face of those who might have been contaminated or sick, infectious, etc. So what we need to do is make sure we're pivoting and making sure that we're taking care of these folks. Number probably 6 or 7 in there are still healthcare workers. So healthcare workers, even though they're first responders, are still affected by depression. But I can appreciate the mental health or behavioral health aspects of their concerns because they're seeing a lot of this firsthand. The thing you see about these populations here, there's lack of thankfulness in the job. How many times have you told a social worker, thank you? How many times have you told the bus driver, thank you? The cab, they perform services that are essential to keeping the lights on, the water running, etc., but they're thankless jobs. So that was a common denominator when they did this survey that find this out. So keep in mind, the face of depression, the impact of COVID on mental health affects us in many ways. It affects different populations in desperate ways. These are disparities, if you will, because they're different types of people, different settings. So when we start looking at it, we need to make sure that all of these groups are dealt with in a way that makes a difference to them. There are certain races, though, that do have some disparities that I will mention, and you see them here. 1 in 3 African Americans receive mental health services when they need it. That means that 66% of folks in the African American population are not receiving care, mental health care when they need it. Opioid overdose is half the rate of non-Hispanic whites. Mental health services, et cetera, are not guideline consistent. So I may treat you this way and you that way, but the guideline says treat you this way here. And so we see different groups receive different types of care. So I think part of, as we talk about our organization, we need to make sure that the right care is being provided. So when I talk about EAP services, let's make sure that everyone knows in all of these populations that they have help that's readily available to them and for them. Now, I mentioned to you earlier about resilience. Individual resilience refers to one's ability to cope with stress, and distress tolerance, which describes one's ability to manage and tolerate emotional stress. If you have low individual resilience and distress tolerance, you have a higher propensity to experience behavioral health or mental health type issues. And unfortunately, our younger folk are struggling with these two conditions, or two types of resilience, if you will. So we've got to make sure that we are designing interventions that help them build resilience. And there's some techniques that they're working on now that you'll probably hear more about, but just understand, we've got to make sure we address it that way. I think you also, if you see those on the right-hand side, that you've seen those before, nothing new there. We've got to take care of our young folks. Another group that we need to take care of they don't show it a lot are our men. Depression is masked by depression, and if you want to find denial, we own it. So we could be lost without a GPS, and we know where we're going. We're denying people sex. So we need to make sure that when we look at men, think about the fact that they may have depression with those symptoms that we showed before, but they may not recognize it. You choose not to recognize it. But I will tell you, when men get depressed and they attempt suicide, they do it in ways that are very permanent. So understand, we've got to make sure we look at all populations with an eye on the peculiarity to their group. How can we be strategic in our journey for wellness? Well, we need to make sure we define the drivers of your organizational culture. If your culture is an outdoors culture, find ways to maximize that. Whatever strategies you come up with, be clear and communicate often. You need to understand that culture can be interpreted differently by members of your organization. So you need to be consistent, but you need to be sensitive. As we mentioned, different groups make up your organization, and they all look at things from their lens of perception. Create metrics that measure your culture drivers. So if you're going to talk about it, create a metric and make sure you're measuring against it. And acknowledge that virtual work is here to stay in one form or another. This real estate that we used to go to and visit every day, I'm not sure what's going to happen with it. But virtual work is not going away like it was before. It won't go back in the bottle. We talked about stress and worry in our organizations. Make sure your organizations, your employees feel that their job is essential to their organization, but also make sure that your employees don't feel that their job is detrimental to their well-being. So you've got to make that balance. You may have to work, but let's try to make you as safe and as possible. And I don't want you to feel that the job is going to be contributing to you getting an infection and or your death or your disability. What steps can you take to protect your employees from the impact? Make sure they have the proper equipment to be safe. Make sure they communicate all the safety strategies that are out there. And then make sure that millennials know that you support their well-being, because for them, they consider your support for their well-being one of the priorities for their jobs. But if they think you don't care about them, as we mentioned, they won't care about the job. And if they don't care about the job, they won't do the job well. If they don't do the job well, it has a direct impact on your profitability and ability to sustain your survival in a very, very competitive world that we're in and moving into. Additional steps: communicate clearly and often. Be flexible in work options. If you're going to talk about COVID-19 information, make sure it's credible. Now, I believe in the internet, but everything on the internet is not necessarily true. So make sure you vet that information. Our workforce is our most valuable asset, and we must find ways to enable them and protect them. As we move into the last couple slides and section, I want to let you know that mindfulness is something that we talk about. People like to talk about yoga. It's a form of mindfulness. Mindfulness is much broader than that, and it's a useful tool. Because remember, in the COVID environment, we are battling depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, burnout, etc., fear, isolation. So we need to have some tools that can allow us to be successful in getting better. I want to read very quickly an excerpt from the Diary of a Lonely Person. It's early morning, as I sit before 3 computer monitors littered with research tabs typing this. The area is shared with 3 colleagues, each with their 3 monitors, hard at work with their own projects. Our office chairs allow for easy swiveling and sliding to connect with one another without ever having to stand up. Removing my earbuds reveals the tappity-tap-tap of fingers on keyboards, coffee cups being refilled, and the muffled mutterings from conversations in adjacent pods. I know all of these people by name and say hi daily. But is that enough to form a meaningful connection? Are we perhaps lonelier than we'd like to admit while we sit staring at our screens? Got to think about that. We did a lot of that. We're going to go back to doing a lot of that. So we've got to find ways to calm our minds. So mindfulness in a nutshell is a psychological process of bringing one's attentions to experiences occurring in the present moment with less dwelling on the past, meaning you're thinking about the here and now. I'm not focused on back here. I'm not focused on up here. I'm centered right here. And I'm bringing myself to a focus, because when I do that, I can start to calm my inner being. And so mindfulness really is valuable. We talked about COVID-19. It has such a disruptive impact on our lives. So we need to find ways to do some things that we can to improve. We got to also remember that when we bring mindfulness to work, we can actually be more positive. Negative feelings can impede strategic thinking. So if mindfulness helps to reduce negative feelings, which can make our company go backwards, then we need to make sure we put mindfulness on the forefront. And as we talked about here, planning mindfully for future moments can influence your positivity, and positivity allows you to be more creative. Mindfulness can be used in all populations, so just know that. But you've got to make sure when you go start talking to different groups of people about mindfulness, you need to talk about it in ways that they can understand, because if you come talk to a group about yoga that has no background on yoga, they're going to look at you kind of funny. So mindfulness will be a new term for many, but you can approach it in a way that's ethnically appropriate and get buy-in. The mind is a terrible thing, but it's even worse when you don't use it correctly, the power of the subconscious mind. Because of how the subconscious mind functions, it manifests what's placed in front of it. If you see down here on the bottom, the subconscious mind has the beliefs, emotions, habits, values. These are things that just go on on autopilot, where the conscious mind is doing a lot of the willpower, long-term memory, logical thinking, critical thinking. But the conscious mind is a small piece. 90% of your mind is on autopilot. So if you don't cultivate what goes into your subconsciousness, and it only manifests what's placed in front of it, you will find yourself having some very unsound thoughts. So we need to cultivate our subconscious mind for improved mindfulness and success. A professor at the University of North Carolina tells us that negative emotions can hit us like a freight train. The level of intensity far exceeds positive emotions. You've heard the old saying that it takes more muscles to frown than to smile. Same thing here. So for reasons unexplained, negativity tends to have a higher priority in our minds than positive emotions. So if I have to have anything I want to have a priority in my mind, I want it to be something positive. And mindfulness can help to change that. Positive thinking allows you to build your skill set. So if I were a young athlete and I played t-ball, and then I played junior ball, and then I played high school ball and college ball, all these things, I learned more and more about my abilities to do more. And so I chose to be able to do that. And that allows me to build. So positive emotions are good for an organization because it helps them to grow. In summary, I know I've said a lot. I know I've said a lot fairly quickly. The slides are available. But I want to leave you with a quick summary. Mindfulness is a successful tool to impact stress in all populations. Positive emotions enhance our ability to build skills and develop resources that help. Depression impacts populations differently. Let's make sure that we tailor our responses. COVID-19 has worsened the behavioral health of many. Let's look out for the younger generations, the older generations, but let's not forget the folks in the middle as well. Use technology appropriately. It can help. And then organizations must be intentional and strategic in addressing depression and loneliness. So with that, I want to pause. I want to say thank you. It's been a lot. But if you have questions, I'd love to entertain any thoughts or comments that you may have. Thank you very much for the time.
Dr. Howell, thank you. There's a question that came through, and it was at the beginning of your presentation, and the person asked if you would share where you found the passage you read at the beginning.
It was Dr. Julianne Holt Lundstedt. I can send you the reference, but I don't think I have it up here. But Julianne Holt Lundstedt, L-U-N-S-T-A-D. She's out of the University of North Carolina. Does a lot of work on behavioral health, a lot of work on loneliness, and I find her, when I read her work, to just be encouraging, because she understands this quite well.
I'm fascinated by this age cohort that you have talked about several times that we have to be concerned about. I think you said 18 to 30, at least on one of the slides. And why, are you saying that loneliness impacts them more, or COVID has done that? Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
So fair enough. So in a line of progression, we all have, loneliness has always been there. COVID-19, if you were lonely before COVID-19, caused you to retreat and cut off all your connections, so loneliness worsened. So that's the connection between loneliness and COVID-19. The challenge with those between 18 and 30 is they grew up a lot differently in a different society with a lot of different tools. And quite honestly, I've got a 26 and 27-year-old. I will tell you, we treated them a lot differently than I was, treated when I was growing up. And so by the virtue of the fact that I grew up developing relationships and having to learn how to be resilient in an environment, we took a lot of that from them in a covered environment, a safe environment that they grew up in. So they have less of the tools to be able to cope with the stresses. So we told them they had to lock down. My 26-year-old who's in grad school, who lives at home, I know her mind said, oh my goodness, what am I supposed to do? I've got a whole network out here I go visit regularly. I can't go see any of them. So we had to come to a compromise to kind of get her back on track. But that's more what it is. They have to be taught the tools to be able to deal in this society with this environment.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because I would think just the opposite. And maybe my context is as my son, who's 15, who had to go virtual school back in the spring, is doing it now. He's still connected. He cooks his lunch with his phone on, talking to his friend every single day. It's very funny, but maybe that cohort's a little bit different than the 18 to 30. But can you talk a little bit? I'm always fascinated about this, the physical effects of mental stress, anxiety. You talked about it's important for people who might be missing regular doctor's appointments if you've got some underlying issues because you're scared to go to your doctor. But I know that heightened stress can shoot cortisol through the body, and it causes other. Can you talk a little bit about how, whether it's loneliness, depression, stress, how that impacts physically how our body responds, and what sort of techniques are available to mitigate that?
Good question. Good segue. If I talk clinically for a second, just understand that depression creates a state of anxiety. Loneliness creates a state of anxiety. Stress is a form of anxiety. Anxiety in and of itself, you mentioned, raises your cortisol level. Cortisol impacts the body to impact your blood glucose. If your blood glucose or your blood sugar is high, it tends to put you into a state that we like to call diabetes. Other hormones that are increased, epinephrine, because you're stressed, it raises your blood pressure. High blood pressure, high blood sugar. Now you got hypertension and diabetes. We've got some hormones that are related to stress that are inflammatory hormones. They impact your joints, they impact your muscles, they impact your tissues. So you might even have a lot of achiness and pain and joint or arthritis type symptoms. So all of these tend to impact the heart. So now you have an impact on the cardiovascular system. So it's more not just one in particular. COVID just makes all this other stuff more enhanced, exacerbated. So it makes your stress, your anxiety, your depression, loneliness, all of it makes it more exacerbated. And when it's more exacerbated, all of this tends to happen. We're already a sedentary society as it is. We're already obese as a society. So all of this doesn't help us at all. In fact, it only makes it worse. So the best thing you can do, and many people did it, when this whole thing hit, we saw tons of people getting out and exercising. They're walking, they're riding, they're working in the yard. We talked earlier about we started projects that we left off and haven't finished yet. But still, we need to keep doing that stuff. Let's let those new habits that came on when we were in isolation transition over into our new lives so we can remain healthy.
Yeah, I've noticed that in our neighborhood too. Lots of bicycles, lots of running and walking, and which is encouraging to see. But you talked about, one way to deal with this. You talked about it at the end. It's this whole idea of mindfulness and meditation. That practice has been around for thousands of years. It seems to have been resurrected in the past, decade or so. I know there's been research that has really demonstrated really positive effects of doing mindfulness practice on a daily basis, whether it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or just bringing attention to whatever you're at. Can you talk about sort of the research behind that, the practice, and what you can relay to some of the participants that are on this call? Because you can go into the grocery line, you'll see a magazine that says mindfulness this, mindfulness that, and just talk a little bit more about that as a technique and a coping strategy.
Keeping it really simple, I will tell you funny you say the most common form of mindfulness, and it's in the research, is prayer. And you know why? It doesn't have anything to do with being spiritual. It has to do with the fact that you close yourself off and you're focusing on a point in time, right then and there. What you're not doing, you're not thinking about stuff you didn't do. You're not thinking in general, and you're not thinking about stuff that still has to be done. So what you've done is we said you're in the present moment and you're just focusing. What we tend to do in society is the first thing we do when we wake up, for many, not all, we check our phones. We see what the messages are there. We click on the internet, see what's happened in the world, and we get ourselves running in the wrong direction from the get-go. Start your day off with some quiet. 5 or 10 minutes, check your breathing. If you were to just breathe and concentrate on your breathing, if you find yourself wandering, thinking about your chores, go back to your breathing. Listen to your breathing. Focus on your breathing. Let yourself just center and get settled before you jump out on the treadmill called life and work. That's a simple way to look at it. Mindfulness is easy, and I encourage you all just to Google it, find some of the articles, see some of the simple tasks and techniques for doing it, because it will allow you to deal with your stress, strain, and challenges of today's society so much easier. So unfortunately, don't have enough time to get into too much more, but it is something I would encourage everyone who's listening today to look up and try to find out how you can insert it into your lives to have a more calm and effective existence.
That's great. I love it. We're kind of at the end here on some questions. I did want to ask if you wouldn't mind back on, I think it was slide, it might have been 8 or 14. And it's just talking about, no, yeah, probably slide 8, but I think you're dealing with strategies, creating the appropriate culture in the office, in your organization, to make people feel connected and less lonely, as it were. Can you talk about that just a little bit as we kind of wrap up?
Yeah, I would say this. I would say if you're a manager of people, if you are a leader of an organization, if you want your people to understand, you want them to care, then we need to show that we care about them. So create a webinar, get on Zoom, get on WebEx, whatever tool you use, and have a all company webinar and just talk about them and their environment, what's going on with them, and not so much about profits and acquisitions or projects. Talk about where they are and figure out with them on a Q&A what you need to do for them, from them. And I would tell you that will probably have the greatest impact. When employees know you care, they care about you, they care about the work that they do. We already pointed out, disconnected folks more likely to quit and do jobs or work poorly. So when they know you care, they will align with the goals and objectives of the organization so much more readily, and you'll be successful.
Well, it's the little things, I think, that work, and it doesn't take a whole lot of effort. So I think that is
it doesn't.
I think that's a great strategy. So we don't have any questions left in the chat, but just for folks to know, if you've got colleagues who want to watch this, we will post it online as soon as we get our master editor back into the office to do some editing. And please share the link. And Dr. Howell, this was a fantastic presentation. You delivered it really well. And I think, just has content that cuts across all organizations. So we really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for Florida Association of Counties. I want to thank everyone out there. Stay safe. Thank you very much.
You too. Thank you, sir.